Hello and welcome to my video. My name is Donovan van Haak and I will be presenting my paper called Defining Terrorism, an Ameliorative Analysis. I recently finished my master's degree in Philosophy of Contemporary Challenges at Tilburg University, for which I wrote my paper, and now I'm presenting it to you for the 2021 International Social Philosophy Conference. Now, in this paper, I basically defend one main claim, namely that we should not define the word terrorism in a morally neutral way, because this may hamper social progress. So let's get right into it. Now, over the past few decades, the word terrorism has increasingly been associated with disapproval and disgust. It evokes an uncooperative and objectionable attitude under both the public and politicians alike. But the philosopher Anna Schweckenberger argues terrorism should nonetheless be defined in a morally neutral way, taking on a purely conceptual approach when defining terrorism. Although she agrees that the moral evaluation of terrorist acts may differ depending on the social harm they cause, she argues that these differences can be clarified after having defined terrorism in an initially morally neutral way. She notes, I find it unconvincing to justify an element of the definition of terrorism by resorting to moral judgments on terrorism, which is the term we have yet to define. And therefore, she purposefully avoids referring to the moral particularity of terrorist acts when defining terrorism, proposing a merely technical definition. In contrast to Schweckenberger's more conceptual approach, the philosopher Sally Haslanger proposes an ameliorative analysis. An ameliorative analysis seeks to identify what legitimate purposes we might have, if any, in categorizing people, and to develop concepts that would help us achieve these ends. Now, she argues that purposes may vary from political to theoretical advantages, and that these can generally be accommodated for under the denominator social progress. Now, taking on this approach, Schweckenberger's definition must be questioned, particularly by asking how the definition of terrorism may ameliorate social conditions. Now, there are two important factors that must be considered when ameliorating the definition of terrorism. Firstly, the definition must not hamper social progress. In contrast, it should create space for technically terroristic strategies to be used and supported if its use can be justified. Now, secondly, the definition of terrorism must consider other compatible desiderata like precision, consistency, and non-arbitrariness, so that the ability of recognizing, tracking, and fighting unjust forms of terrorism does not get lost. Now, there are good reasons to believe that Schweckenberger's definition fails the first ameliorative stipulation. By defining terrorism in a morally neutral way, she thereby already brands justifiable usages of technically terroristic strategies as terroristic, as she does not transcend the technical definition. However, this is problematic for a crucial reason. Recall that the word terrorism has, sociopolitically speaking, an essentially negative connotation that is unlikely to disappear, evoking aversion, denunciation, and a generally uncooperative attitude. As Steinhoff points out, whoever seriously poses this question, can terrorism be justified, runs a good chance of being excommunicated from the so-called discourse community, and of not even being listened to in the first place. Justified usages of technically terroristic strategies have to face a great barrier to social progress due to this connotation. By defining terrorism in a morally neutral way, Schweckenberger removes the possibility of excluding just usages of technically terroristic strategies from the word terrorism, for example, by alternatively calling them freedom fighters. If the definition of terrorism should stimulate social progress via the conditions I proposed above, or previously, it follows that Schweckenberger's definition is problematic, as it does not sufficiently consider the first condition. Now, by the very fact of defining terrorism in a morally neutral way, a definition could potentially hamper the social progress of just usages of technically terroristic strategies, as the sociopolitically negative connotation remains attached to such usages. Conversely, like moving away from a morally neutral definition towards one that adds justifiability or unjustifiability as a component can meet the aforementioned like ameliorative conditions, I suggest. Because by excluding justified usages of technically terroristic strategies from the definition of terrorism and naming such usages differently, the negative connotation of terrorism can be bypassed, with the result that social progress can more easily be generated. It also leaves space to recognize, track, and fight unjust terrorism. By dividing terrorism as unjustifiable regarding the creation of social progress, justified usages of technically terroristic strategies would thereby be excluded. If we only make the distinction between just and unjust terrorism after branding a group as terrorists, as Zweckenbecker, for example, proposes, those justified usages of technically terroristic strategies are stuck with terrorism's negative connotation, thereby hampering their ability to create social progress. By shifting from Zweckenberger's definition to a definition that includes unjustifiability as one of its components, we can satisfy the ameliorative conditions by only branding individuals or groups as terroristics after having determined 1. What justifiability entails, and 2. Whether particular cases are just or unjust according to these pre-established notions of justifiability. According to such a definition, some cases that Zweckenberger would have called terroristic would not fall under the denominator terrorism if they were to be sufficiently justified. Now, obviously, this does raise the vital question about what justifiability entails, and this is a broader ethical question which I do not entirely get into in this paper. But what is important to be said is that to transition from an abstract definition of terrorism towards studying whether concrete cases are terroristic or not, the concept of justifiability at least requires clarification. And following Hesselanger's ameliorative theory, what usages of technically terroristic strategies are justifiable must be set out in terms of social progress, according to her theory. Moreover, the exact conditions of social progress must be formulated at the outset in order to see whether concrete cases of technically terroristic strategies should be labeled as terroristic or not, assuming one wants to make the definition of terrorism compatible with the ameliorative desiderata. In conclusion, Hesselanger's ameliorative analysis implies a shift from a morally neutral definition of terrorism to one that includes justifiability as a key component of the definition. Zweckenberger's definition cannot meet the ameliorative desiderata, as its inclusion of justified usages of technically terroristic strategies under the word terrorism still brands such usages with a negative connotation, thereby hampering social progress. By adding unjustifiability to the definition of terrorism, justified usages of technically terroristic strategies are excluded from the word terrorism, improving their conditions to create social progress. Thank you.